Welcome to the very first episode of The Agency Leader with me, Razy Shah. I'm excited to have my friend and fellow agency owner, Joe Escobedo, the brand builder, join me on the very first episode. Hello, Joe.
Hey, Razy, good to see you as always, my friend.
Yeah, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how did you end up in the agency world then?
Good question. So if I move back about, 15 or so years, I actually started out as a journalist in China and then realized that journalists don't make much money. I couldn't make a livelihood off of that. So I moved into PR. This is many years ago in China. As I moved into Singapore, I had one corporate stint and then moved back into the agency world and then worked in that space for, I would say about 5, 6 years before starting my own business.
Yeah, and how long has it been? Now you run your own content marketing agency called Esco Media. How long has that been? And maybe you could share a little bit more about what does Esco Media do?
Yeah, good question. It feels like about 30 years. It's been about 3.5 years, I think. And each year it evolves. So we started out as a training and education business. The second year, we started the content strategy and creation side of the business. The third year, we started the media side of the business. So doing things like branded podcasts. But I think the common thread that really brings all these pieces together is education. As you mentioned, I teach at different universities. I share a lot of tips on LinkedIn and other platforms. So education is really at the core of each of these different elements.
Nice. So let's talk more about agencies, right? I think one of the challenges that agency owners have, especially when we are starting out or when we're new, we have this inability to say no to new opportunities. And what happens is that someone will come and say, "Hey, Joe, can you build a website for us? Or Joe, can you set up my LinkedIn page for me?" There'll be some new requests which are not in alignment to what you want your agency to be. And because we're chasing revenue, we end up saying yes to those opportunities. So how do you find yourself saying no? Or how do you say no to such requests?
So to be honest, when I first started the business, I didn't say no. Because one of those things where not only was I starting my business, but I also had to get an EP for myself. So the whole visa issue as a foreigner, you have to show revenue. If you don't show revenue, you basically are out the door. So that was a tremendous amount of pressure. And I did take on things that I probably shouldn't have taken on. And I was probably more desperate than I am now, much more desperate at the time than I am now. And so that actually led to a lot of what we were talking about earlier, lost pitches because they could see I basically needed it. They were strong arming me as much as possible on things like rates and things like that. So it was really tough the first year. I think I was working about 12-hour days just to get things off the ground. Eventually, it picked up as we started getting more clients on board. They became happy with their stuff. But yeah, the first year was tough. Now we're in a position, knock on wood, where we do say no to different clients and even pilots. So there's one pilot that we worked on recently that I'm thinking about just cutting because it's probably not the best fit. So for me, it's really about salvaging the relationship as much as possible. And if it's not a good fit for either party, I'd rather just be like, keep the money. I'll refer you to someone else, but then we can still help you in some way or the other.
Yeah. You mentioned the word pitch. And one of the things I've find myself doing in my other fellow agency owner friends, we do a lot of pitches. We pitch, we put in a lot of effort, and then they say, "Oh yeah, you were one of the top three agencies. Oh, you were the top two agency." But we know that there is no third prize and there's no second prize. And it's very demoralizing or very demotivating when you work really hard on a pitch and lose. So how do you deal with losing pitches for your agency?
Yeah. So I'm very much like you were talking about. I get quite pissed off. And so I'll share one story in terms of why I no longer do pitches anymore. So I think it was about last year around that time that someone reached out to me, one of my contacts. So I knew we've met up for coffee and things like that. And he says, "Hey, we're launching this new initiative and I'd love to have you pitch for it." He says, "Man, I'm reaching out to one or two other organizations for the business." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, sure. Like we know each other. I assume that our chances are pretty good." And then put all this time and effort into building it out. And I submitted it and I didn't hear back from him. I'm like, okay, it's on. And then I responded nothing back. And I was like, okay, this is really weird. I was like, this is because he was the one that reached out to me. And eventually he was like, yeah, sorry, we didn't proceed with the project at all. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, we just scrapped it. So whatever you put together, it was nice, but we couldn't get the budget. We couldn't do something. I don't know whatever it was. And like that for me was a tipping point because I was so pissed at the that point that I was like, I won't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing that's been very helpful for us and how we built the business is moving away from pitches to pilots. Because going back to what I was saying earlier is sometimes you're just not, there's not a good fit in terms of chemistry.
Mm.
For us, I'm fortunate it rarely happens. It may happen to me once or twice, but it does happen. And so when that does happen, I'd rather we'd find out in the first month that like, let's part our ways, amicable, and then we'll figure something out between the two of us. Rather than putting all this time in building a pitch, this 3-year strategy, and then you obviously one of the I forgot what procurement calls it, the third tender or whatever you
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
The
So
third-
yeah, the third quote. So often, and this is I'm gonna speak the truth to the smaller guys, you often are the third quote. Meaning that if they have an incumbent of the big agencies and stuff like that, then they pretty much know who they're going to go with, but they need that, third quote for procurement purposes. And so I think it's the biggest load of BS in this space. And I've actually talked about it publicly that we should outlaw it. Half of people agreed with me, half of people didn't.
Yeah.
But I think there should be some debate there in terms of is this even, relevant? Because on the client side, it takes a lot of time to build a proper brief document. If you're doing it properly, if you're putting out some shit like you've done before, then so be it. But it takes a lot of time for them as well, too. So you're building it out, and then the agency is building everything out. So you're spending hours, maybe days, sometimes weeks building these things out. And is this really productive, or is just something we're doing it for ticking the boxes for procurement purposes? So I personally, I don't do them anymore. If someone reaches out to me and says, "Can you do a pitch?" I will say, "Thanks, but no thanks," because at that point, it doesn't make sense for us.
But I understand the concept. Instead of pitches, you're doing pilots. But how do you convince like a new client, someone who's yet to work with you before, to actually take that path because they're so accustomed and groomed into having 3 quotes as part of the due diligence for the procurement process that if you come along and say, hey, look, let's do a pilot. How do you like change that
A
mind?
couple of different things. I think first of all, you have to understand the pilot threshold. Like I'm not going to pitch $100,000 pilot because one, it would not get approved by procurement. They would need the 3 quotes for that. But if it's under the budget threshold, just to show proof of concept, then they're generally okay with it.
Mhm.
Going back to convincing them, so I could share my sales story in terms of that, but I was a terrible salesperson. So I'm not very good at convincing people. What I am decent at is helping them find out what they would like to do, like
Yeah.
a quick call. And if they haven't figured that out or they haven't seen enough value in me and the organization, I will politely walk away from it. And I've given that to clients, not clients, but prospects recently. And they said, we want to see all these things. And I was like, look, we have a lot on our plate right now. If you want to proceed with us, great. If not, then that's cool too. It's really up to you. Like I said, we're not, putting any pressure on you either way.
It's a and I'd say it's a very enlightened approach. And you mentioned, so when did this start? So the tipping point, when was that? Well, sometime last year.
Yeah, it was sometimes last year. Yes, I could share our original pitch story of what my soul crushing one, how we originally met. But I think we have to share that for episode 2.
So everyone has to go through this journey, right? Where you need the business, yes, and you go into all the pitches. But once you have gotten to a certain level and you're known for your work, then you have that and the peace of mind to be able to say no to pitches. Because one of the things I've discovered that we do at my agency a lot is a lot of pitches. And when you don't win, like I said, it's very demoralizing for the team. So now maybe coming back to you, Joe, like in terms of running the agency, how does your day look like?
Yeah. So first off, I think one thing I just want to clarify is people always ask me, is what do you do as in an agency? And I wouldn't necessarily consider us an agency, although we fit in a similar type of model, because I think what we're doing is quite diverse in terms of the business. And also, I've built it in a way where we're not going after volume, meaning I don't want 50 to 100 clients. That would just, I would have more gray hair. We focus on going deeper into different companies. So we really consider ourselves, as cliche as it sounds, an extension of their marketing department. And I like to think that we are in terms of the transparency that we get. Like we get access to a lot of different analytics and things that most agencies don't get access to. So that for me is something I think in terms of our business model, we really focus on is going deep into a few organizations rather than going very narrow into a lot of organizations. So that's first. But your question is, how do I spend my day?
Like how does Joe's day look like a typical Esco media day?
So it's changed over the years. Obviously, when I first started, like I said, I was working 12-hour days. So I was actually doing some consulting work for another agency full time. I would teach for an educational firm at nights from 7 to 9. And then I would come home after that to work on my company from like 9 to 11 or whatever it was. And I would do that for basically a year straight until I was like, okay, this is going to stop eventually. So that was first year. We're 3.5 years in. I wouldn't say I work as many hours. I think I probably try to think smarter than I did because at the time I'm just, spinning the wheels trying to get as much money as possible. But now I really focus on doing a couple different things. I don't sleep very well. I wake up, I think about 5:30 or 6 every day, and I start working before my kids wake up. And I do basic things. I check on my emails. I maybe look at the books and accounting and things like that. So all the fun stuff beforehand. And then for me, at least this week, I've done a couple podcast interviews in the morning, or I've created some kind of content because that's one thing that I really enjoy doing. So I try to do it while I still fresh in the morning. And then the past couple of days this afternoon, I've done quite a lot of workshops.
Yep.
So usually an hour and a half virtual workshop. And then after that, I'm pretty much dead because I'm an introvert. And any long conversations really, really drain me. So I have to go outside and take a hour and a half walk. I know it sounds like I'm being unproductive during that time, but that's where a lot of my ideas come from is when I'm having these walks and I get to think about, okay, what are some new things I should be doing, or what new content should I put out, or all these different things that come through just me getting out and taking a walk every day.
Yeah, I think it's really important, like to have that time where you are away from the desk and away from work. Like your first year sounds really intense. You're saying you consulting for an agency, you were teaching in the evenings, and then when you get back home, you work on your own agency.
Yeah.
That sounds like the path to burnout, right? So I'm sure through that you must have discovered some like self-care practices. And you mentioned that you take long walks. Like what else do you do for self-care? Because I think that's really important for agency leaders also to have some self-care practices.
Yeah. I think for me, like I said, taking long walks, one thing I try to do more of is create content now that I have a bit more free time on my hands, is create the kind of things that I enjoy doing. So whether it's writing or whether it's creating videos, doesn't have to be super business related, but just something that I want to do that's creative. I've done a series of interviews with local businesses in my neighborhood, just as a way to, do something creative that's not kind of day to day business work. So that's something that keeps me energetic as well too. It keeps my brain quite fresh.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. I've not seen those interviews with the business owners. Are they on LinkedIn or are they on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, it's on the YouTube. I've only released a couple of them so far, but I'll probably share them soon.
Nice. Okay, I think that'd be interesting to watch.